Welcome to Bible Study, Parody, and Subversion in Matthew's Gospel. There is an old story about a Jewish man who moved to a new town and started attending the synagogue. He found that the synagogue was divided into two factions, those who stood up when the Torah was read and those who sat down. The two factions debated bitterly, never coming to a conclusion, and there was no rabbi in the small town to help them out. So the man went to the nearest rabbi in a larger town, 50 miles away. He told the rabbi, "There are two factions in our synagogue. One says that we must stand when the Torah is read." And the rabbi said, "No, that is not the tradition." Then the man said, "The other faction says that we must sit when the Torah is read." And the rabbi said, "No, that is not the tradition." And the man said, "Well, the two factions argue endlessly about this." And the rabbi said, "Ah, that is the tradition." This story may be a joke that Jewish people tell about their own culture, but the humor works because it is a humorous commentary on the very real tradition of debate. Much of the Talmud is composed of debates between rabbis. One recent article by a Jewish writer entitled "Debate is a Jewish Sacrament" describes the Talmud as one long dispute. It is really important to understand this part of Jewish tradition when reading the debates that Jesus has in Matthew with other Jewish groups, especially the scribes and the Pharisees. It's not that these debates are friendly debates, like most debates between rabbis. The debates between Jesus and the ruling class Jews are debates between a peasant radical and those whose power and authority he threatens. And these debates are not about insignificant minutiae. They are debates about justice, and Jesus' own life hangs in the balance. But they are also not debates about the validity of the Jewish tradition. Jesus is not arguing against Judaism or the Jewish tradition. He is rather arguing within the Jewish tradition. He is arguing for an interpretation of the tradition that prioritizes justice. Biblical scholarship has, in recent decades, more and more found Jesus' arguments to be comprehensible within rabbinic debate, even in chapter 23, the focus of this episode, a chapter in which Jesus really lets loose on the scribes and Pharisees. Biblical scholar Yair Furstenberg, in his recent article, Jesus Against the Laws of the Pharisees, the Legal Woes and Second Temple Intersectarian Discourse, argues that Jesus in chapter 23 uses accepted legal arguments that can be found in the Dead Sea Scrolls and rabbinic writings, which also criticize the Pharisees along similar lines, but without the ethical emphasis. His conclusion is that Jesus adds the ethical emphasis to these arguments. And he is not saying that the rabbis never had ethical concerns, but merely that the particular arguments that Jesus uses were ethical versions of particular rabbinic arguments that did not originally feature ethical concerns. The rabbis definitely had ethical concerns, some that even coincide with Jesus' teachings. For example, the famous saying by Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai after the destruction of the temple that deeds of loving kindness will replace sacrifice could be seen as an ethical teaching that coincides with Jesus' teaching. Outside of Matthew, the New Testament speaks of a closer, if still fraught, relationship between Jesus or Jesus' followers and the Pharisees. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is often seen as a guest in their homes. In the Gospel of John, the Pharisee Nicodemus becomes a secret disciple of Jesus. In the book of Acts, the Pharisee Gamaliel argues in the Sanhedrin in defense of the followers of Jesus. And of course, the Apostle Paul, a student of Gamaliel, becomes a follower of Jesus and a leader in the movement. The picture of Jesus in the New Testament seems to be so Pharisaic that the Jewish Encyclopedia, a highly regarded scholarly work by Jewish academics, has this to say about the relationship between Jesus and the Pharisees. Only in regard to intercourse with the unclean and unwashed multitude, with the Amharites, the publican and the sinner, did Jesus differ widely from the Pharisees. In regard to the main doctrine, he fully agreed with them. And that seems to be the sticking point between them. Jesus and his movement seem to interpret the laws of Israel in a way that does not marginalize people, and that restores those already marginalized to good standing in society. The Pharisees also sought to restore all the people. They were just using a very different strategy, and that made all the difference. But we will come back to that later. For now, my name is Bert Newton, and this is episode 58 of Bible Study, Parody and Subversion in Matthew's Gospel. Jesus starts out with a statement that reveals his alignment with Pharisaic teaching and his difference with Pharisaic practice and interpretation. Let's read verses 1 through 4 of chapter 23. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore do whatever they teach you and follow it. But do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they teach. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on the shoulders of others, but they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to move them." These 4 verses seem to reflect what the Jewish Encyclopedia says. In doctrine, or in terms of the body of law held to be sacred, Jesus is fully aligned with the Pharisees, but in terms of practice and interpretation, he is distinct. So Jesus tells the crowds and his disciples to follow the teachings of the scribes and Pharisees, but not to do as they do. When Jesus says that the Pharisees tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on the shoulders of others, he is speaking to the way that the law is interpreted. Scholarly analysis of the interpretation of the law by Jesus in Matthew and the other Gospels reveals that Jesus interprets the law in a way that lifts the heavy burden off of the common poor. In other words, Jesus' yoke is easy, and his burden is light. The heavy burden that the Pharisees lay on the people that Jesus is referring to may be their program of advocating that all people adhere to the rules that the Torah requires only of the priests. They believed that if everyone did that, then God would liberate Israel from foreign oppression. So their program was, at least officially, a program of liberation, and a sort of priesthood of all the people, something that the New Testament also advocates, just in a different way. But of course, the common people could barely comply with the normal laws, much less those required of priests. So this program that was supposed to liberate them became a heavy burden that they placed on the people. In contrast, Jesus interprets the law in a way that lightens it. Jesus proceeds to criticize their practice. Let's read verses 5 to 12. "They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. They love to have the place of honor at banquets and the best seats in the synagogues, and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have people call them rabbi. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all students. And call no one on earth your father, for you have one Father, the one in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant. And all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted." Notice how Jesus doesn't criticize the basic practice of wearing phylacteries or fringes, but rather their length. He criticizes the scribes and Pharisees for trying to grab honor. He has been teaching his disciples to assume the lowest place of honor, to dispense with privilege, And his criticism of the Pharisees and scribes is for doing the opposite, always trying to grab more honor for themselves. And so he gives some of the most egalitarian teaching in the whole story here. He warns against titles. He says, "Call no one on earth Father." This, of course, sounds strange to us because Father to us, unless perhaps you are Catholic or Eastern Orthodox, Father is a word reserved for our biological or adoptive fathers in the nuclear family. But that is not what Jesus is referring to. As I've mentioned in earlier episodes of this podcast series, the term father was used in the ancient Mediterranean world to refer to the social position of the head of a household. The household could be a local household that included servants and slaves, or it could be a clan, or a tribe, or a nation, or the empire. Caesar was understood to be the father of the Roman Empire. The entire society of the Roman Empire was, in fact, constructed in a pyramid of households, each headed by a father. So Jesus is warning against using this highly patriarchal title that was a central feature of the domination system of the empire. Interestingly, in Mark's version of the story about the rich man wanting to be a follower of Jesus, Jesus tells his disciples that anyone who has left house or brothers or sister or mother or father or children or fields for his sake and the sake of the good news will receive 100-fold now in this age houses, brothers and sisters, mothers and children and fields. Notice that Jesus leaves out the category of father in the list of what people will receive in this age. People will leave fathers, but will receive only mothers in the new society. That's in Mark 10:38-41 if you want to go back and read that. Back to Matthew. Let's continue with verses 13-15 of Matthew 23. "But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you lock people out of the kingdom of heaven. For you do not go in yourselves, and when others are going in, you stop them. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you cross sea and land to make a single convert, and you make the new convert twice as much a child of hell as yourselves." The Pharisees were a political movement, and like all political movements, sought to make converts, to recruit new members. This recruitment probably happened mostly among other Jews, but there is evidence that they recruited among Gentiles as well. Much of the literature of this recruitment that is written in English uses the word convert, which implies that the Pharisees and perhaps other Jews were converting people to Judaism, a religion, in the way we understand religion today. But as Warren Carter notes, the Greek term being translated as convert was used in the ancient Greek version of the Hebrew Scriptures, which is called the Septuagint, to refer to foreigners or resident aliens who live permanently with a clan, adopting Israelite customs, including those that we today would call religious, thereby becoming Israelite. These were people who joined the Israelite nation. In the U.S. today, this would be like an immigrant acculturating and perhaps becoming a U.S. citizen. But what about the Roman period, especially after the destruction of Jerusalem, the time in which the Gospel of Matthew was written? It appears that the Pharisees and or other Jews continued to recruit people into their nation even after Jerusalem was destroyed and the Jews virtually lost their homeland. Carter notes that Horace and Tacitus comment negatively on Jews compelling others to join them. They view this act as one which threatens societal order by undermining cultic customs, patriotism, and households. They lamented that Jews teach Gentile converts to, quote, despise the gods, to disown their country, and to regard their parents, children, and brothers as of little account. And so it is interesting that this recruitment activity is understood as subversive by the Romans. It reveals a possible wider context for Jesus' comments in the chapter. Jesus in Matthew 23 criticizes another movement which, at least sometimes, can also be subversive to the empire. The strategy might be different, but at one level, the goals are aligned. As in all ages, people and movements are complex. Matthew gives us a scene of Jesus harshly criticizing the Pharisees. But perhaps his critique might be more nuanced if reported by a different writer. The other Gospels reveal more alignment than Matthew does. Given the prophets and the long history of domination by foreign empires, many Jews, even Pharisees, were naturally subversive to some extent. Jesus, however, seems to be calling them to a more pure and holy subversiveness, not just against empire, but against classist oppression. The Pharisees may be out recruiting from the nations, but they continue to lay a heavy burden on the peasantry. And their purely nationalist approach could be another difference with Jesus and his movement. Jesus reaches out to the Gentiles too, but does not seek to make them Jewish, but merely to incorporate them into God's new transnational society. Let's continue with verses 16 to 22. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, "Whoever swears by the sanctuary is bound by nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the sanctuary is bound by the oath." You blind fools! For which is greater, the gold or the sanctuary that has made the gold sacred? And you say, "Whoever swears by the altar is bound by nothing, but whoever swears by the gift that is on the altar is bound by the oath." How blind you are! For which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? So whoever swears by the altar swears by it and everything on it. And whoever swears by the sanctuary swears by it and the one who dwells in it. And whoever swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and the one who is seated upon it. Jesus has previously in chapter 5 made clear that oaths are not necessary. Oaths functioned in the ancient world to make lying, in the absence of an oath, justifiable. And from a legal standpoint, they do so in our world as well. Corporations pay lawyers good money to write long terms of use for their products that protect them from any misleading statements or advertising. And that's what Jesus is arguing against here. He is arguing against this type of lawyering. By picking apart the logic of the sorts of oaths that his opponents claim are lawful, he shows the absurdity of the logic. Rather than all this lawyering, by which the wealthy are able to gain advantage, Jesus calls for honesty in all legal, political, and economic interactions. Let's continue with verses 23 to 24. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. It is these you ought to have practiced without neglecting the others. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. When Jesus says you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, he is referring to the Pharisaic practice of tithing things that are not required by the law. The Torah did not require the tithe of herbs, but Pharisees did that as a way to do more than the law requires, thereby building a fence around the law, something that I've mentioned before in this podcast series. Building a fence around the law is likely what Jesus was doing in the Sermon on the Mount, when he said, "You have been told such and such, but I tell you such and such." And what Jesus was telling them to do went above and beyond what the law requires. So both Jesus and the Pharisees build a fence around the law. And Jesus doesn't actually criticize the fence that the Pharisees build. He says, "You should have done these things." But he criticizes them for neglecting justice, mercy, and faith. You might think of other modern analogies, but I think of those of us who try really hard to lead ethical lives, making sure we buy fair trade items when we can, avoid eating meat because it is bad for the planet, avoid using fossil fuel transportation as much as we can. But if we are not actively working for justice at a systemic and structural level, then we have, as Jesus states, strained out a gnat and swallowed a camel. Straining out a gnat, of course, refers to straining a gnat out of one's drink. In that society, it was a matter of ritual purity. But we wouldn't want a dead gnat in our drink either, so the metaphor works for us too. It's also worth noticing what Jesus said should have been done: justice, mercy, and faith. The first two, justice and mercy, refer not just to justice and mercy for the poor, but also the establishment of a society of equity and compassion for everyone. Then there's the third item, faith. As I've mentioned before, this word refers to more than just the ability or willingness to believe in supernatural things. It has to do with loyalty and steadfastness, perseverance. To have a society of justice and mercy for everyone, we must be steadfastly loyal to each other and to God. Let's continue with verses 25 to 28. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisees, first clean the inside of the cup, so that the outside also may become clean. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside look beautiful, but inside they are full of the bones of the dead and all kinds of filth. So you also on the outside look righteous to others, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. The reference to the washing of cups and plates and whitewashed tombs all have to do with topics that the Pharisees and scribes actually debated. Jesus does not take sides in these debates, but uses them to create metaphors that communicate a critique of outward pretense and internal corruption. And when I say internal corruption, I don't mean that this is a critique only about their internal integrity. The term that the NRSV translates greed, in reference to what is inside the cup, is better translated plunder or robbery. It is a term often used to describe oppression, what the powerful do to the less powerful. And the term lawlessness is not only ironic because the scribes and Pharisees are supposed to be teachers and keepers of the law, but it is also a term that was often used of oppressive empires. Let's continue with verses 29 to 30. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous. And you say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would not have taken part with them in the shedding of the blood of the prophets. This, of course, is how it often goes, isn't it? People like to think that if they lived during times of previous injustice, they would have stood on the side of those who spoke and acted for justice, the prophets. Many today honor Martin Luther King while opposing the current Black Lives Matter movement. How we act in the face of injustice is a better indicator of how we would have acted in the past than any memorials that we might erect or honors that we might give to past heroes and prophets of justice. Let's continue with verses 31 to 36. Thus you testify against yourselves that you are descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your ancestors. You snakes, you brood of vipers, how can you escape being sentenced to hell? Therefore I send you prophets, sages, and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town, so that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I tell you, all this will come upon this generation. When Jesus says that they are descendants of those who murdered the prophets, he means that they are heirs to that tradition. He ends by calling them this generation. The term generation doesn't necessarily mean a whole group of people living at one time. It can mean those generated from a common paternity, a lineage. Thayer's Greek lexicon includes as a definition for generation that which has been begotten, men of the same stock, a family. Jesus is saying that they are family with those who killed the prophets because they continue the tradition of killing the prophets. In a flourish of vintage Middle Eastern hyperbole, he makes them responsible for all the innocent blood shed on the earth because they continue the tradition of murdering the prophets. He says that they are guilty of all the blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah. While Abel to Zechariah comes across in English as A to Z, that doesn't work in Greek, Hebrew, or Aramaic. Jesus is rather pointing to murders that span the breadth of the Hebrew Scriptures. The murder of Abel was the first murder in the Bible, in Genesis 4. The Zechariah being referred to here is probably the Zechariah who was the son of a priest murdered in the temple in 2 Chronicles 24. You see, the Jewish order of the books in the Older Testament is different from how Christians order them. In the Jewish order, Chronicles is all one book, not two, and is the last book of that Bible. The Zechariah murdered in 2 Chronicles 24 is one of the last murders in the Jewish version of the Older Testament. So the murders of Abel to Zechariah span the length of the Jewish Bible. Now, I say that the Zechariah mentioned here is probably the one in 2 Chronicles 24 because we can't be sure. The Zechariah of 2 Chronicles 24 was son of Jehoiada, not Berechiah. The Zechariah who was the son of Berechiah is mentioned in Zechariah 1:1 and is the prophetic voice of that book. But there is no indication that he was murdered. Whereas the murder of Zechariah, son of Jehoiada, fits the description of the murder that Jesus is describing. It appears that the author of Matthew has made a mistake. It is possible that there is a lost tradition that the Zechariah of the prophetic book was also killed in the temple, but that is doubtful. The author probably made a mistake in his reference. That a detail is not accurate should not surprise us. We already know that the author of Matthew turned Mark's one Gadarene demoniac into two and made other changes to the material that he got from Mark. We also know that ancient texts of all biblical books, including the gospel texts, have variants, differences that are almost always insignificant details. This mistake only stands apart because it makes a reference that we can track, and there is no textual variant that makes the reference correct. Perhaps we'll find one someday, but I doubt it. And I think we should expect and even appreciate this sort of mistake in the text. It brings home the fact that this is real, ancient, subversive literature produced by a dissident community that didn't have the luxury of paying proofreaders to go over the text, nor the luxury of being able to correct minor mistakes with the stroke of a key on a keyboard. And accuracy in details just wasn't as important to ancient writers as it is to us today anyway. Let's continue with verses 37 to 39. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often I have desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. So, after having let loose on the scribes and Pharisees in Jerusalem and made them responsible for all the bloodshed on earth, Jesus suddenly cries out a lament for their city, declaring that he would have liked to gather the city to himself as a hen gathers her brood. This might seem like emotional whiplash to us, but in the culture of the Middle East, such extreme expressions in seemingly opposite directions happen all the time. And it's not so hard to understand when we realize that Jesus really is a champion of his people and their traditions that are centered in Jerusalem, that he shares much in common with the scribes and Pharisees, and that the author of Matthew is likely a dissident Pharisee. This is anger at family members who are obstinate and wayward and are in fact planning to kill you. What they are planning to do is evil, but they are your family. Jesus describes Jerusalem as the city that kills the prophets. There is a long tradition in the ancient literature of Israel that speaks of Jerusalem and or Israel this way, as a city that kills the prophets, and also pronounces judgment on Israel for these murders. And in those texts, judgment is meted out by God through domination by foreign empires. And that's what Jesus does here. When he says, "Your house is left to you desolate," this is a reference to the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70. It is in fact a statement that reflects the point of view of the author and the author's community in the late 1st century. The term desolate may be ironic here. Desolate translates the same Greek word that elsewhere in Matthew is translated desert or wilderness, as in when John the Baptizer did his work in the desert, a deserted place, and when Jesus was tempted in the desert, and when Jesus fed the multitudes in the desert. The desert in this story has been the marginal place of some of the most profound work of John and Jesus, where the movement gained strength. It has been the place that contrasted with the city. But now the city will be a desert. The house, the temple that dominates the cityscape of Jerusalem, will be left desolate, a deserted place. Jesus says, "You will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord.'" What Jesus means by that is difficult to say. It is the greeting that the crowds gave him in chapter 21 when he entered Jerusalem. But those crowds were likely Galilean pilgrims. The city of Jerusalem is dominated by the temple establishment. Their crowd will call for him to be crucified. Some commentators have suggested that when Jesus says that Jerusalem won't see him until they give him the same greeting that the Galilean pilgrims gave him, that this is not a predictive statement, but a conditional one. That Jesus is saying that they will not see him again until they are ready to welcome him and his message, as the Galilean pilgrims did. At any rate, between now and then, the city will be left desolate through judgment meted out by Rome. And Jesus will say more about that in the next chapter, which will be the topic of the next episode. For now, my name is Bert Newton. The music for this episode has been provided by Bob Nolte and David Martin. Please spread the word about this podcast. One way you can do that is to give it a 5-star rating and a glowing review so that others are drawn to it and the algorithms prioritize it. Thank you to all who have done that. You can send comments and questions to subversivewisdom@gmail.com. This has been episode 58 of Bible Study, Parody and Subversion in Matthew's Gospel.